Managing Violence Podcast, Season 6, Episode 5, with the founder of Target Focus Training, Tim Larkin. I'm your host, Joe Saunders.
They were doing things that they didn't realize they were taking a risk with. It was just part of their life. They didn't realize like the level of risk they were taking. And I call that, basically sleeping with your head on the railroad track. And what people do is they keep doing it because the train never comes, and then without warning that one night the train's going to come.
The Managing Violence Podcast is brought to you by Australian Warfighters Coffee. Now, as you guys know, I interview guests from all over the world, which means that I'm quite frequently working on the show either very early in the morning or very late at night. So between a full-time job, an unusual schedule, and 4 children, I consume a lot of coffee. And given that I live in the coffee capital of Australia, I can be a little bit picky with what I choose to consume for my caffeine, depending on what's available at the time and how urgently I need it. But Australian Warfighters Coffee not only make a top-notch blend, but they also give back to the Australian veteran community by investing in training, education, and employment for our Aussie troops. So we'd like you to support those that support us, and in turn help Aussie veterans with the transition into civvy life. Check out www.australianwarfighters.com to find out more or to purchase their epic coffee. As we welcome them into the team, into the tribe of the Managing Violence Podcast. If any of our listeners out there purchase anything from AustralianWarfighters.com, send me your receipt to joe@joesaunders.com.au and I will send you an Australian Warfighters Velcro patch to throw on your gear and rep the brand publicly. We thank them for their service and for supporting the show. All right, everybody, welcome to the Managing Violence Podcast. I'm joined here by Tim Larkin. Tim is one of the world's leading self-defense experts and the author of How to Survive the Most Critical 5 Seconds of Your Life, Survive the Unthinkable, which had a foreword from Tony Robbins, and When Violence is the Answer. He's trained everyone from US Navy SEALs to celebrities and blue-chip corporate executives, and was famously banned from entering the UK in 2012 due to his staunch pro-victim stance on self-defense. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, there's a lot to unpack just to that introduction alone, but let's start off at the beginning. How did you get started in this field? What's your origin story here?
I had a grandfather that was really into combat sports, basically boxing. I missed really the whole UFC MMA thing. I was probably about, I would say probably about 10 years early on it. It all came about right when I was in the military, but I boxed and I had 3 different black belts, prior to me graduating high school. I've always been into martial arts, and I'm also a Navy kid. So my dad was an officer in the Navy. We moved around. So I only lived on Navy bases for the most part of my life, and very used to it. One of the last places I lived when my dad was in the Navy was Coronado, California. And the Navy housing that we lived in was literally right across the street from the SEAL training. Basic underwater demolition school. That's where you go for your initial training. So I was introduced to it. I was like 12 years old, and I couldn't believe there was a job that, you got paid to do this kind of stuff. And it was the only thing I wanted to do. My dad was horrified because back then the SEAL teams were like redheaded stepchildren. It wasn't thought of nobody encouraged you to go into SEAL teams back then. Because there really wasn't a career path. If you were an officer, if you made 3 ranks up, you'd be amazing. You're never going to see any senior ranks back then. So anyways, I did this. And the only reason I tell this story is to just kind of let people know, but I'll give a very shortened version. Basically, I learned everything there was to learn about the SEAL teams. I had made friends with a lot of the guys that were there. We jumped the fence all the time. We played on the obstacle course. I mean, I knew the obstacle course by the time I was 13. I knew how to do a lot of the obstacles and stuff. I was just very fortunate that I just happened to be there. Had I not been there, I would have even known about the SEAL teams probably, because it just wasn't widely known back then. So this was my big goal, right? And so I get there, my dad's, the only thing my father made me do, he says, listen, I need you to go to university. He goes, I want you to be an officer if you're going to do this, at least get your education. So I agreed to that. I got an ROTC scholarship, which is a military scholarship to school. And I flew through. I mean, my only focus was being a SEAL team. So physically and mentally, and I just did everything I could to prepare, which was amazing. I was up against 2,500 people for 2 slots. So 2,500 guys that were officers. There was 2 slots available the year I could go, because again, they discouraged you to go. I did everything. I made sure that not only did I look great on paper, but I knew everybody else looked great on paper. I flew to DC and I sat in the detailer's office. He's the guy that actually makes the decision. They made me sit there for like 3 days without talking to anybody. They would just want to see, what I do. And then I got 5 minutes with this guy, and basically he goes, midshipman, because I was a midshipman. And then he goes, why are you here? And I said, well, sir, I know you got a tough decision. I just want to let you know I will never quit, if I go. And so I just knew that gave me everything. And there's nothing else I could do, meaning, either I get the slot or I don't. And I thought I blew it. His answer was such that I was like, I probably shouldn't have done this. And so sure enough, I'm walking down the hall and I'm in the Navy building. It's like huge. It's not as big as the Pentagon, but it's a big building. I'm walking down this really lonely bureaucratic hall when a young officer who was assigned to that office ran down, after me. And he just tells me, he goes, I couldn't let you leave. He goes, I just wanted you to know you had the slot after the first day. We just wanted to see how long you'd stay. And we figured, you'd keep going. So they were just screwing with me, So anyways, I get in and I kick butt. I just do really, really well. I know, and I had such an unfair advantage because, I since 12 years old, I knew everything there was to know about training. And I knew where to hide food. I knew how to train your guys. I knew all that stuff. So I was killing it, and I was pretty arrogant about it. And I went all the way through. I was 2 weeks away from training, from going to SEAL Team 4 back then. And I had a diving accident right before. I blew my eardrums. And what happened was I was underneath the water, and then it just, all of a sudden I was congested that day. I was stupid to do the dive. I shouldn't have done the dive. But anyways, I burst my eardrum. It feels like a cold spike of water goes in the middle of your brain, and then all this warm fluid goes out of you. And that's when you lose all sense of reality. Now, the reason that's important to what we're talking about right now is because that was my first true introduction to injury. True injury to the human body, meaning no matter how much I could will it, tough it out, or anything, I had no control over my body. They said when my head hit the surface that I was slapping uncontrollably, blood coming out of my ears. And no matter what I wanted to do, I could not do anything other than react to that particular injury right then and there, which then became like the focus of my life. I thought my life was over at that point because you're a young guy. All I ever wanted to do was be a SEAL team guy. And I knew in that one instance, my ears were done. There was no way I could dive. There's no way I could do pressurized diving. They kept me in the community, and I have a strong martial arts background, as I told you earlier, before we started here, that, I was really into martial arts. And I got assigned to the Admiral's staff on the SEAL teams. I couldn't be a SEAL, but they made me an intelligence officer for special warfare. So I only worked in the special operations community as an intelligence guy. But I got to do a lot more things. They were very nice to me. They allowed me to do a lot of things that really were way outside my purview as an intel guy. One of the things we looked at was hand-to-hand combat. And this was right after the Berlin Wall came down. So I'm giving away that I'm a very old man now. But back then, they knew the world was changing. It was really interesting. The staff that I was on was literally stacked with the heroes and the legends of the SEAL teams at the time. And it was their job. They looked at it and said, hey, listen, the world's changing. We've got to change our methods and our tactics to understand that we're not fighting the Soviets anymore. And they predicted everything that's going on right now. They really predicted like warfare today, and they predicted back then Bosnia Herzegovina and all of that stuff. It was fascinating. But they realized that they weren't training people back then. Hand-to-hand combat was looked at as basically useless, meaning it was looked at as punchy, kicky stuff, meaning if you got into a hand-to-hand situation, you somehow failed. And that's true. I understand the methodology. But what happened when I was there was we were bringing in martial artists and combat sport practitioners from literally all over the world, because the SEAL teams were looking at, listen, we got to revamp our training. And what they found out was, and I got to be part of that. And the only reason I got to be part of that was because I was on the staff. I had no combat experience. I'm a failed Bud's trainee basically that blew his ears. I mean, in that world, you're like lower than pond scum, theoretically. But they liked me, and they kept me in. So they invited me to be part of this group that was evaluating all these different, hand-to-hand options. And we ended up finding, I actually found the guy which is a whole other story. But I ended up finding the guy that ended up being, he's a former Vietnam vet, and he had a very unique approach to violence. And we didn't call it violence back there, we call it fighting. But basically his whole thing was, injury to the human body. And he wasn't formally educated, but he was very smart. He saw arcs and angles that very few people saw. And his Vietnam years, he was in a unit called the 173rd Charlie Company. And those guys were just extended in the jungle all the time. And he was a tunnel rat. And he had seen a lot of combat and a lot of death. And then his training that he had done in the martial arts world was all based off of really just, what we would call today violence. It's very similar to the way the prison gangs look at violence, which is a very different way than most of us view violence. It was very results oriented and very agnostic, meaning, you don't care, you would look at a particular approach, like say you'd look at something, hey, well, I learned this, say, in jiu-jitsu, or I learned this in taekwondo, or I learned this in Thai boxing, or I learned this here. The question was never like, where did you get the information? It was, okay, what you just did it get a result? Did it actually get a result on the human body? And so that, to me, because it was so personal to me, here I was, bigger, faster, stronger trainee who was unstoppable, who already saw himself back then at SEAL Team 6, it's just a matter of time. And I get waylaid, I get taken out by one of the string, a little membrane in my ear bursts and literally turns my world upside down. And so I learned that, hey, what's really interesting about the human body is it's highly resilient in a lot of areas, but there are specific areas of the human body that cannot take trauma. And it doesn't matter how much you try to protect yourself. It does not matter how much you work out. You can work out all you want, but these areas of the human body are still vulnerable. I can work my neck all day, but it's not going to protect my throat from being crushed, and so I just started looking at things very differently from, I think my martial arts and combat sport days were more competition based. And we were looking at winning a competition, and we didn't realize back then how much competition, training for combat sports is such an indirect path to effective violence for self-protection. Now, one is not better than the other. I don't mean it that way. It's just, combat sports are not designed to maim, cripple, and kill your opponent. It's to better him tactically. And you want your opponent to be able to compete again. You don't want to leave the person there. I mean, and that's exactly how it should be. Whereas true violence is just about destruction. And destruction is a super easy skill set. It doesn't really require a tremendous amount of skill to be able to be very good at using violence, just to hurt somebody, just to take somebody out. I equate it to combat sports. I equate to if, say I had 50 people, just imagine everybody listening to this right now, you're in a class with me, and I pull in an 8-foot piece of marble, beautiful Italian marble, and I bring in a master sculpting kit, and I tell the class, hey, you guys don't get lunch until I see Michelangelo's David. Get to it, We'd be there probably 1,000 years, it would just never happen. You don't have that skill set. But if I took that same piece of marble and I told all of you, hey, here's a bunch of sledgehammers, I need this reduced to rubble before lunch, guess what? You guys would get the job done, because destruction does not require the skill set. What requires a skill set is, to be able to take that and sculpt it into something, which is exactly what combat sports is, because the only way to be able to do combat sports is if you gamify violence. And the only way you can gamify violence is if you take direct injury to the human body out of the equation. And as I always say, last time I looked at the UFC rules, and I'm living here in Vegas, so I want to be very crystal clear. I am a huge combat sport fan. Some of my really good friends are competitors and stuff, so I have the utmost respect. So I know there are other guys, like there are people in the reality self-defense world that try to have this ridiculous conversation that, it's usually some guy who's like 80 pounds overweight, and, he's in his commando gear, and he's talking about how MMA is this and blah. Dude, I'll put you in with my MMA buddies and we'll see how well you do, in your fantasy world. So what I'm trying to get across the audience is, though, the only way you can gamify violence is if you take out the direct injury. And so 27 of the 31 rules last time I looked took direct injury out of the equation. Now, it's kind of cool. It's kind of like I remember I took an improvised explosives class years ago, and we went into Walmart out here, which is a big, a big store out here, for, shopping and stuff. And we were able to go in and just get a bunch of random, chemicals and, cleaning products and stuff. And we were able to make really, really effective explosives. And the reason that's interesting is because it's the same thing. If you look at the rules of the UFC and turn them upside down, you can see what direct injury to the human body is. That's your Rosetta Stone right there. If it's outlawed in combat sports, it's because it's going to do deliberate harm to the human body and take the brain out of the equation. And so that, to me, was always fascinating when you went to direct injury. And very few people taught direct injury. Back then, this guy was one of the first guys to really do it. And then what was cool was at Naval Special Warfare back then, we had a very big sports medicine component of Navy docs. And what they helped us do was, basically look at the anatomy of the human body, and they started to quantify a lot of the injuries that we did. We looked at, what nerve strikes do versus what vulnerable organs are available, what parts of the human body can't take, direct trauma, what's achievable with your own body versus what do you need a tool for. All this was really interesting. We had to be careful because we got a lot of pushback when we tried. I imagine we tried to get some additional academic research done on injury to the human body, and the particular group, the place we went to, was very uncomfortable with it. They thought somehow they were trying to equate it to maybe like, some of the very infamous Nazi programs that were out there that were doing tests on prisoners and stuff like that, which was not the case. What we were trying to do is we were trying to show, hey, basically, if we're going to face violence, here's my assumption for anyone, law enforcement operator, military operator, or civilian. I'm going to assume that you're going to be facing multiple attackers. I assume those attackers are going to be bigger, faster, and stronger. And I assume they're going to be carrying weapons. Those are my baseline assumptions when you look at training. And to approach it that way is very different than approaching it from a competition standpoint. In competition, you have defined upon, you have agreed upon rules. You have a ref that will enforce those rules that we both agree on. And you have a defined area that you will be fighting with, with those agreed upon rules and with that ref. So it's all very controlled. And you also know your opponent for the most part. I mean, even if you only have 2 weeks out, at least you know who you're going to be fighting, so you can research them. You can see what their skill sets are. You kind of know what to expect when you get in there. All of that.
You're unlikely to be jumped on the way to the octagon by
exactly. None of that exists. None of that exists in the real world, and that's where we've done that. And quite honestly, that's where UFC guys and MMA guys come to me. They come to me and they say, listen, I just don't train this. My brother, this happened to him the other day. A knife was pulled on him, and I really didn't have anything to tell him. I didn't know how to deal with that. And that's where they come to me and ask me questions about, what do you do with real violence? What do you do when somebody has a tool? What do you do? What's the most important thing? And that's where you quickly understand the value of training your brain and body to deal with violence first without tools. And then when you get to add tools in, it's a luxury. It's fantastic. But, it's a very unique thing. Whereas before, like when we deal with military operators before, we started doing this type of training, you would go to a military operator and you'd say, what's your primary weapon? Now, back then, they would have said something like a CAR-15. CAR-15 and my 226 is my secondary weapon, my SIG 226. You go, and so good. And then we'd tell them, well, yeah, but you're wrong. Your primary weapon's your brain. Your first ancillary weapons, supplemental weapons, is your body, and everything else is just, a luxury basically after that. And so when you understand that, the brain really is what makes a human dangerous, and it's not a semantics. It's absolutely, it is what makes us dangerous. And then we know how to operate our body, whatever our human machine is. That's the other thing too, is you learn very quickly that oftentimes when you see people who are extremely good at doing violence, they're oftentimes not the physical specimens that you would imagine. There are some. I mean, I've been to a couple of the federal prisons here in the United States, and you see some of these guys that are these shot callers for a lot of these larger, well-known prison gangs. And yes, there are some guys that are physically incredibly intimidating. But what's interesting is some of the more violent ones really aren't. When you just look at them as human beings, you sit there and go, they're not physically impressive, but they don't hesitate, and they know where to do real harm. So anyways, I guess that'll give you kind of my setup of, how I ended up and how I look at the subject. And then, wherever you want to go from here, let me know.
It's a really nice introduction. Tim, let's just quickly cover off on the books. How did the books come about, and what was the reception as you started writing and sharing some of this methodology?
It's interesting. Prior to 9/11, you pretty much could put out, anything really. I mean, it was really liberal on what you could, and it's funny to say that, like, to even say that now, like it was like you pretty much, it was pretty much like you could put out, some what would be today absolutely banned, because it would be marked as, I literally had a Facebook, when I finally got through to somebody, I had a Facebook person tell me, well, that would just probably make somebody feel bad if you did that. Like the fact that you're reminding them that, they could be a victim of violence, that might make them feel bad. The kid literally said that to me. And I was like, what do you, how you're making this decision. You just arbitrarily made this decision that this might bum somebody out. So, good luck.
I'll just tell you, I once just recently did a Zoom call with a corporate client, and in the background I had the Rex Applegate book, Kill or Get Killed.
Yeah,
and it was on my bookshelf, and they're like, "What's that book about?" All of a sudden, it was very scary that I've got this book about killing people. And it's,
I got to meet him before he died. He was amazing. Cool. It was a random event. It was a military event that I was at. I think it was, I want to say it was probably at the SHOT Show or something. It might have been. And he was just sitting in the corner by himself, and he had his cane and everything. And I recognized him right away. And I went down and I got to talk to him for like 45 minutes.
Wow.
And he was talking about it back then. He was bummed. He said, yeah, the Marines are the only ones that, that he thought at that point, he goes, the Marines are the only ones that are really, looking at, hand-to-hand combat as it pertains to warfare back then. That's what he was bumming out. He was just bumming that he thought that, the gamification and the popularity of MMA as a competition was being that hand-to-hand combat was taken from a warfare skill to a esprit de corps skill, meaning just motivating for the troops, have competitions internally. And they didn't see it as a true, quote unquote, skill set, war skill set. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is if you train competition, there's a disconnect if you are fighting for your life, and you have to be able to overcome that. And many people have talked about that. I mean, I have Australia. In fact, we had an SAS, or not SAS, a commando, one commando guy who trained with me a couple times, Paul Kell.
Oh, I know Paul. Yeah.
Really. Yeah. Well, Paul tells a great story about, the fact that when he stopped doing martial arts was, when he came in and he did his first, he used a knife. And I think it was one of the first, since Vietnam, one of the first recorded, knife kills was on there. But Paul was very honest about it. He was trying to do, I believe, a Kimura on a guy, snapped his wrist, and guess what? The guy kept coming because it wasn't a debilitating injury. I mean, it didn't take the brain out of the equation. Pain is a terrible way to judge whether or not something will work, because everybody's pain tolerance is different, as Paul found out with this guy. And he goes, oh my God, I was competing with this guy who was trying to kill me.
Yeah.
And that's the danger. And that's all I try to tell people is, like, you do what you train and you will default to whatever you do. So if you train with something where, things are not allowed, then you will default to that initially, your initial response. You may be able to overcome it. There are people like Paul that recognize, oh, damn, and then went right into kill. Okay, but you don't want to rely on that. So what I try to tell people is, listen, I don't discourage competition training. It's fantastic. I did it as a kid. I loved it. But I think you have to ask yourself, when it gets to a certain point in your life, okay, what am I training for? What's my ultimate goal? Like I do a lot of firearms training. Well, I'm not training to be a 3-gun competitor. That would be fun. Don't get me wrong. I'm training. I want to learn how to fight with a gun. I want to be a true gunfighter with it. And the guys I train with, that's what they're training me for. Because I realize as I get older, I want to be able to be really, really good. And I only want to focus on things that will protect me and my family. And so there is a challenge that you have, and there is a real risk that if all you do is combat sport practicing, then if you run up against somebody who just wants to use violence, you may be behind the curve.
Yeah. So I interrupted. We were talking about the books. So let's quickly cover off on that. How did you get started writing?
The books were, basically the first book was just a series of blog posts that I'd done articles over the years. Is Survive the Unthinkable, how to survive the most critical 5 seconds of your life. And that was an underground bestseller. I mean, hundreds of thousands of copies have gone out on that. Did really, really well. When I started I met Tony Robbins through a friend. I trained him, his family, all the staff, and then he had me, train his organization. He has a group called the Platinum Partners. It's like his top level group, and so I would go and do seminars with them on a regular basis. He was very adamant about getting the word out to the females, to the women. And what happened, what predicated that was, we were at an event in Maui. And he talked to the group. He said, hey, listen, he said, I'm not saying that anything actually happened, but let me know in the last week or so, how many people felt uncomfortable in a situation where you saw the potentiality for violence? And what was really interesting was maybe 5% of the men, their hands went up. More than 95% of the women, their hand went up. They're just far more aware of the potentiality for violence that we aren't, meaning men. And listen, we should celebrate the differences of gender. I'm not, this is ridiculous that we're having these gender wars and everything right now. It wasn't that women are less capable. It's just they're given bad information. And so that's what Tony's big thing. He said, so, hey, listen, he goes, you should write your first published book with a publisher to the female community. And he goes, I'd love to help you with that. And he did. He was amazing. He was super supportive, and that book did really well. It did well. It did. It was. I got a lot of press on it. Women really, really liked it. And then, what's strange is we did a follow-up book where I wanted to get to the whole general public. Basically, I wanted men, because I have a lot of men in there, and I wanted to update what I'd been writing, from the 5 seconds book. And then I did When Violence is the Answer. And it was great. The title tested really, really well. Everything went great. The content, people loved it. And then the election happened in 2016. And I got killed because all of a sudden, the fact that it had violence in the title, I was immediately, with all the rhetoric with, the Trump, Clinton thing going, the whole world changed. And all of a sudden, stuff that I could always advertise and do, I couldn't even get the word out on the book. Now, I was able to sell more than enough copies to get into royalties, and I did really well, but the book never did what it really should have. They would keep me off the New York Times list, even though I was outselling other people on the list. It was just completely biased because they felt somehow, and I get it, if you just look at the title, it might seem like you're promoting violence, but it's supposed to be provocative, because if anybody understands me and understands what I do, I am the person that absolutely lays out, that rare black swan event where the tool of violence would ever be justified. And my protocols actually are far more congruent with a peaceful society than what we currently do right now, but it was just one of those unfortunate factors. So the book's out there, still doing very, very well. It's just I can't really promote it.
Yeah.
You know, Google and Facebook are still uncomfortable with the subject matter to where they won't even do things. What they'll do is it's a lot of people, I'm sure, you know, in this world, you know, when you're looking, you notice all of a sudden you're not seeing as many posts from people you follow and stuff like that. It's because their content's just being, you know, basically just shrunk down and, you know, shadow banned. So it's a reality.
That's a shame. I mean, that book, I mean, as you said, the title grabbed my attention when I saw it come out. I thought, ooh, that's interesting. Yeah, because I guess when we're in this field, and especially when you're seriously in this field, you recognize that, yeah, sometimes violence is the answer. And we dance around that topic and we try to make it sensible and sensitive to, I guess, to the sheep of the community. And I don't use that term derogatory. I'm just using it in the Dave Grossman way of the sheep and the sheepdogs. You want the idea is that you try to make as many sheep into sheepdogs as you possibly can, but you still got to communicate to them as sheep when you start with them, because it's not palatable otherwise. But that book is, as far as I'm concerned, probably one of the top 5 books on self-defense that I recommend. Certainly in the last few years, I think.
Thank you.
It's tremendous.
Yeah, because there are a lot of good guys that have written, so that's nice. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, and certainly I've had the privilege of interviewing just about everybody. just about.
No, you got good list of people.
So you're the missing piece when it comes to great authors.
Rory has some interesting takes on stuff. His stuff is always solid. You know how he looks at things. I appreciate his stuff. You've had some really interesting people on, but that's just it. It's a weird topic because it's probably a topic that when you need this information, you couldn't have paid enough for it. Meaning it's absolutely everything. You know, that's why I said, you know, the name of the first book, you know, being most critical 5 seconds of your life. It's well under 5 seconds for most people, but it is. It's just that's how quickly your life can be turned upside down by violence. And why is it worth studying the subject? You know, but I wrote the book When Violence is the Answer when I came to a revelation, and I got to give some credit, even though it's horrible. I can't believe I got to give this guy credit, but I give credit to Tony Blauer. Tony's actually a really good friend, and we were hanging out one time, and he told me a great story. And I love telling this. I just want to give him credit for it because I could easily steal it from him, and I won't do that. But he was talking to a woman on a flight. He was tired. He had been training. You know, he'd done a couple seminars flying back, and this woman was kind of chatty, and she said to him, "Oh, well, what do you do?" And he said, "You know, I wasn't even thinking," and I blurted out that I did self-defense, and right after I did, I go, "Oh no," because she's like, "Oh my god, I want to do self-defense. I've always wanted to do self-defense, blah blah," and she's, you know, just vomiting all this stuff out. And Tony was not having it at that point, and he just looked at her and he goes, "No, you don't." And she goes, "What?" He goes, "No." He goes, "Listen, if you really wanted to train self-defense and you really wanted to be part of, you know, do the training stuff, you'd be like me." He goes, "You'd be seeking out the information all the time, you'd be training all the time. It would just be a passion of yours." He said, "I think what you mean is, do I have any information that will help you live a life that minimizes the chance you'd ever need self-defense?" And that to me was the game changer, because when I realized that's, you know, and anybody that teaches this stuff has to understand that the vast majority of the individuals you meet, even in military and law enforcement at times, believe it or not, really are of that attitude. They don't necessarily want to train self-defense. They want to learn, how can I live a life that minimizes the chance of needing self-defense? And that's what a good portion of the book is most people don't have they're very quick to want to physically train. And that's great. Punching, I can teach others. You want to learn how to kill somebody right now? Boom, boom, here you go. I'll give it to you. It means nothing without the proper training of your mind on that. And most people don't have their head wrapped around violence the right way. And that's why I wanted to lay it out, you know, in that manner for people, because I think it's probably the most important taboo subject that's out there. Because the problem is, when you delve into this, people can, like we said earlier, it can look like you're promoting violence, which is absolutely wrong. That's the last thing in the world that you're doing. You're actually trying to help people navigate the world so they don't do something stupid. They don't bring something into their life that, had they just, you know, been trained better, they would have avoided that. And so that's my goal. My big goal with people when I look at clients is, a lot of them, prior to coming to, train with me or read one of my books or something like that, they were doing things that they didn't realize they were taking a risk with. It was just part of their life. They didn't realize like the level of risk they were taking. And I call that, basically sleeping with your head on the railroad track. And what people do is they keep doing it because the train never comes, and then without warning that one night the train's going to come. So my goal with clients is to identify all those things that could be like that, and just take your head off the railroad track. Because once it's off the railroad track, we don't have to worry about the train coming anymore, and the best feedback I get from people over the years, it's never about when they have to use the information. And especially my military and law enforcement guys, there's some amazing stories like that, but I expect them to do well. I expect them to use that information. I expect them to, in the course of their job. What I really like is when I've trained a civilian and the civilian writes me back and says, "Hey, Tim, such and such happened the other night. The old me would have done this, but I recognized it for what it was and I got myself out of there, or I disengaged, or I did that." That's when I sit there and go, okay, great. I made a huge difference in that person's life. They get it. They're going to make better decisions now. Behavior modification is really my goal with people. If you want to physically train, I love doing that. I mean, I'll go as in depth as you want. I'll show you the most brutal, effective stuff right up there. I don't sugarcoat any of that stuff, but I also recognize, that's a smaller portion of the public that actually wants to physically train. So that was really interesting. I learned that probably about 10, 15 years ago, that was more the case. There are those hardcore people that still want to train. I love them. They're mutants like me, and we just like to do this stuff, and you've got the podcast going. Obviously this is a huge deal for you, but we are not our customers.
No.
And that's what we have to always constantly recognize. And you can do a tremendous amount of good without actually physically training people. That's the other mind-blowing concept for me, was that, hey, I can actually give people good principles and methods that they can apply without physical training that actually keeps them a lot safer.
Absolutely. And I think, as you said, like most people, most of our clients, most of our customers, they don't have the will, or they won't prioritize the time to really put in the hours to train as much as they would need to get to where they think they need to be be able to handle every situation physically. I mean, most people that want to do self-defense want to do a 6-week course. They don't want to train 5 hours a week for the rest of their life. Like that's not what they want to do. And that's fine. It's just a matter of being honest about the priorities and say, okay, well, if you're not going to do that, what can we give you to make you safer? And realistically, everyone needs that pre-conflict or that preventative training more so than they need the physical anyway. Actually, I'd be interested to get your thoughts. Are you across the incident that happened with Anthony Smith, UFC fighter, recently? Where
there've been a couple. Which one was Anthony's?
So he woke up with a intruder in his home. I think he was in Vegas.
Was it the kid that was there? He was surprised how good the wrestler was.
Yes,
it was a 20-year-old kid. Yeah. Okay, yeah, I remember that one. That's a perfect example. So here's I can't tell you, and again, these can come off as I'm somehow saying one is better than the other. That's not. Anthony approached it like he'd normally approach controlling a person coming in. Okay. And this is my big thing with, the big thing about jiu-jitsu, the only thing I'll say about it is I love jiu-jitsu. I think it's amazing. I'm kicking myself because years ago I had a chance to train with Machado brothers when I was in LA for a couple of years. And I trained a couple of times. That's when Joe Rogan was just starting out with those guys. And like an idiot, I didn't cut the time to do it. Not because I necessarily was really big into it, but it would have been amazing to train with those guys at that time, because that's when it was all kind of coming up.
Very underground.
But so I'm saying this, but what's really interesting to me is why has it swept? Why has jiu-jitsu swept like the military and a lot of law enforcement? And when you really examine it, usually the story goes like this. Like when I talk to some of my Navy buddies, they'll say, well, we're over the sandbox, we're arresting this guy, we're trying to nobody can hold him down. He's like, oh, there's like 4 of us trying to hold him down. And then little senior chief so-and-so comes over and he spider monkeys up on him, he takes him down just like that. Oh, we all got to learn jiu-jitsu. You know, like everything was around basically prisoner handling and cuffing and stuff, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is when you're in a dynamic situation against somebody that just wants to do violence. A lot of the, you know, tying up your limbs in a lot of different ways so somebody can just deploy a weapon and start stabbing you. And the classic story that I have for that is over in Afghanistan, there are Marines at a checkpoint. An IED had just gone off, an explosion had just gone off. This suspicious car is driving away. 3 Marines stop it right away. All 3 draw their guns. They tell the driver to get out. The driver actually does get out. The driver and the 2 people in the front seat, driver and the passenger, they get out. There's a passenger in the very back. He's not getting out. One of the Marines approaches, you know, deploys his weapon, puts it back, goes in and starts pulling the guy out of the car. The guy jams him out of the car, and they start getting into it right away. The other 2 guys are just kind of watching while they're there. Now, what was interesting was when asked, they said, well, why did you guys initially just watch? And they go, oh, the Marine, their buddy, oh, because he was winning. Meaning they saw it, they literally saw it as thing. What they didn't realize was the guy was trying to deploy a hand grenade. The bad guy was trying to deploy a hand grenade. He could care less what the Marine was trying to do. The Marine was trying to wrap him up and do all this other stuff. This guy's just trying to get the grenade out. This Marine, to his credit, realizes too late what's going on, and he literally throws his body on top, killing both of them, and posthumously getting, I believe it was the Navy's cross that he got for that. What was interesting was the after effect, and this when the Marine, a Marine that I trained, a gunnery sergeant that I trained, sent me this report, and he goes, "Here's the report. Here's what they didn't realize, though. They didn't see that their training was like these guys." The question was, if the guy had come out with a gun, all 3 of them would have engaged him and killed him at that point, you know, again, but they saw hand to hand as a competition. Yeah. Even though this guy was just as committed to killing as he was before. So there's a danger in these things. Now, listen, there's nothing wrong with jiu-jitsu. It's excellent. My kids are all training in it right now. I have nothing. I think it's a fantastic thing. You just have to realize that when you put yourself into situations where your response is always going to be a certain way, it may not serve you when violence is in the mix, you know? And you just have to be aware of that.
Yeah. I had the fortune to attend a seminar with Hickson Gracie a few years ago, and he talked about the same thing, that the more you sportify jiu-jitsu, the further away you get from the mindset that you need to apply it in a real violent situation. And I mean, Brazilian jiu-jitsu really evolved for that challenge match culture in Brazil, whether it was on the street or whether it was in a ring or wherever it was, but it was a one-on-one honor fight, more or less. That's what it evolved for. But certainly there was an awareness of weapons and so on. But I think the more it has become a sport, it certainly has grown exponentially worldwide as a sport. And look, I'm saying this as a judo guy. You want to talk about a sport that evolved for, or an art that evolved for sport. But when you look at that, you lose the mindset. And I think what Anthony Smith's account indicated was that he's a nice guy. Like, he's a really nice human being who probably has never really thought about having to kill somebody or having to do serious harm to another individual out of anger. And despite having all the skills in the world, as one of the top 10 fighters in his weight class, he had all the physical attributes, but the mindset was lacking. And he was trying to control the guy. The guy's I think there was a weapon involved. He was trying to stop him from accessing the weapon, and
he was mentally challenged. He was a mentally challenged guy. He had some things there. He was strong. He was a strong, and he was a former wrestler.
Yeah. What a terrible combination of.
Yeah, and that's what he couldn't. I remember when he was saying that. That's what he couldn't believe. He couldn't believe how strong the guy was, and then he kept telling like stuff that normally worked for him was not working on this guy. And the main reason is it's just you have to ask yourself. Also, I tell guys all the time, when you test things, like, what are the stakes when you're testing them? Like, I'll give you a perfect example. There's a guy here who I got a ton of respect for. I won't say his name or anything, but he's a former, well, we'll call it Delta Force operator. He's former Delta guy, and he's real. But he said stupid stuff like, "You can't take my eye," and blah blah blah. I just, but it's all BS the way guys, do eye gouging, and it's just like, I'm like, how can you say something so stupid? I mean, that's just retarded. I mean, there's no other word for it. Like, you are so narcissistic, you're so gone in your head. It's like, okay, so what he's talking about is, okay, put your eye. Now I'm going to close my eye really hard. You got to go in there. I feel like, great, knee him in the nuts. As soon as you just knee him in the nuts, he'll give away on the eye and you take the eye right out. I mean, it's just like basic understanding of human trauma. It's like, dude, what are you talking about? I can take anything I want on you if I set it up, I mean, and I'm not going to do it the way you want me to do it. Any moron can Monday morning quarterback saying, oh, you're going to do this, this, and this. Okay, well, I'll do this. And then you do something completely different. I never sit there. I go, I tell people all the time, in the old days, the old way I used to train in the military, I would have guys that would be like, well, I wouldn't do this. Like, it's a cooperative effort, the way we train. You're learning injury to the human body. You're letting somebody use your body. And there's the whole methodology to that. And if guys would play games, I'd go, hey, listen, do you want to train or do you want to fight? Because I'm cool either way. It's just, and they go, well, what are you talking about? And they go, we would have shown something they're supposed to be mimicking. And the guy would go, well, I just don't think that would work. I go, okay, well, let's do it. And then I do something completely different, lay them out and go, hey, moron, we're learning to do a specific thing. This is not the way we think a fight would go down. We're trying to coordinate our body to move in a certain way to give us more options. Because what you want to do is you want to give yourself various sight pictures when you're training of the human body. And you want to say, okay, from this particular sight picture, what's available to me? What body tools can I use and how can I affect an injury? It's a learning cooperative process that you get. And the best people in the world at doing real violence to each other, at killing each other with their bare hands or improvised weapons, this is how they do it. And they all reside in the prison system. They don't train the way we think you're supposed to train. They train very specific and very much focused on direct injury to the human body because they can't afford to get it wrong. The stakes in prison are much higher than like what the special operations guy was saying. He was basically doing locker room, aggressiveness, not really, hey, if we don't get this right, there's going to be repercussions. Meaning our gang's not going to have the yard. We're not going to be able to make money. We're not going to be able to do this, or they might come for us next. We got to take this guy out. We can't afford opinion. We have to have results, and that's the world I live in. That's the world that I like to talk about. I don't like to talk about theories, on things. I like to talk about results oriented, and it's very deliberate. It's very simple, very straightforward. I mean, when you really understand violence, it's not a hard subject to understand, and it's not a hard skill set. What's hard is to mentally prep yourself for when it would ever be applicable, and legal. The sociopath, and you don't have to worry, they could care less. They're just going to use the tool. The challenge for me is I can train you to be on par with the sociopath. I can absolutely do that. But in order to do that, I have to take you through this journey in your mind on when it would ever be applicable. And I have to make sure it goes with your moral compass on this. And that's the challenge to me. And after all these years, I still get just as excited as I did 20 something years ago doing this stuff. When I get a new class, it's basically when I get brand new people and they're going through the initial seminar, that's my favorite thing to teach. Because that's where the biggest change happens. That's where the mental change happens. And then after that, it's all easy. I mean, and then it's physical training, and I can take them as far as they want to go after that. But to watch that switch that goes off when they realize, oh, I never thought of it that way, and oh man, I'm gonna definitely make changes in my life now. That's really cool.
Yeah, and that was for me as an instructor. That was one of the big leaps I guess I made. Was I went from training people that recognized that violence was part of what they had to do, and you're talking about people in prison systems, like you can't. There's no denial about violence if you're in a prison, right? You know that it's a possibility. You know that it's probably a probability. You know that it's a tool of the trade. It's a form of communication. It's all those things. It's part of life. If you're training a military that are actively deploying, they know that violence is part of what they're doing, and even if they're not in a direct combat role, they know it's something that may visit them. And when I shifted from training police, bouncers, etc., to regular civilians who had a level of denial about whether violence was ever going to be something that they had to even contemplate, when you sit in a privileged high castle of safety, because you live in a first world society. It was governed by laws, and you have police, and you have protection. You can kind of look down your nose at people that have to train in violence and go, well, they're thugs or they're barbarians. And I guess this ties back into what you're saying about the reception to when violence is the answer, is that it's this kind of this elitism that no, violence is never the answer until it's the only answer. But be able to access that that switch to make them see things through a different light, and so you don't have to want violence, you don't have to seek violence, but having a familiarity with it could mean all the difference.
Oh yeah. It's interesting. You're based in Australia right now, and so I had a really interesting about 2006, 2007. I'm in Victoria. I'm at the head of what would be the equivalent of in the United States of your FBI Academy. It was a huge law enforcement, federal law enforcement group that was there, and I did a big presentation there, and it was really great, and the people were really receptive to it. And then afterwards, one of the senior guys took me in the back and he shared with me a report. And he said, yeah, he goes, we haven't really widely distributed this. He said, but he goes, there's this illusion in Australia. He goes that, we're way safer than we are. He goes, I thought you'd find this interesting. And basically what the report did, they did an aggregate report. They took all the top cities in Australia, in the whole country. They aggregated them all together, aggregated all of the crime statistics, and it would make, I think you guys would be the biggest city in the United States for sure, and by far you'd be the most violent city in the United States. And it was and the reason being is because it's so spread out, and the data, when you add up things little individually, but when you put it as an aggregate together and you put in there, there's a lot going on. There's a lot more violence going on than people are aware of. And I noticed that it's funny. It's funny, like UK, same thing.
Yeah.
I've noticed a lot of the first world places that pretend they're not violent. The potentiality for violence is amazing, on there. Now, third world, it's a different question. Like in the first world, I'll show something and people go, well, is that legal? Is that, and so I have to get through that. And, hey, listen, that's a very legit question. I'm not denigrating that, but I walk them through that aspect of it. It's really interesting. When I go to Eastern Europe, South America, Asia, parts of Asia, when I go in, the question is always like, no, wait a minute, where do I put the foot? Where do I, they want to know exactly how to get the result. They're okay they understand when there's a potentiality for violence. So they're far more comfortable with it, and they want to make sure they get the mechanics right. So it's a really interesting teaching dichotomy. I go outside the US and it's just, I can say it on this podcast because I don't think, but basically my big thing was I got a bunch of Eastern European guys that I was training. They were awesome. I'm like, man, if I had a battalion of these guys, I could just take over the world, because they're really funny, man. They're just like, they just do it. It's just like, they don't ask any questions. It's like, oh, okay. I remember this one guy, he was a doctor. He looked like Drago, he looked like the old Drago thing, Dolph Lundgren. And I remember he was working with a military operator, and we were teaching people to take the eyes. And this guy, the military operator, has glasses on. And so there's a little translating going on. And I tell people to work, and the guy that has the glasses on isn't really paying attention. And all of a sudden, this doc just goes, boom, it just goes right in. Eye goes right in. He's in there, goes, whoa, shit, boom. And just like, he didn't take his eye, but he did everything to the brink. And it was, it got this guy's attention. He said, oh, it's real for him. And it's like, yeah, I told him, I go, dude, these guys live in a society where they're probably going to have to use this. And I said, so yes, they're very particular about learning it the right way. And it's interesting. And what's interesting too, is those people are far more peaceful, believe it or not. I find that in first world countries, like this is this weird combination of, we avoid learning about violence and everything. We say it's really bad, but man, are we socially aggressive? Man, are we rude? Are we things that you couldn't get away in a society that's far more adept at violence? Meaning, there's a level of respect. I tell a story. I don't know if you know who Charles Poliquin was.
Yeah.
He's really a really big strength coach, and he's a good friend of mine. And Charles was definitely a difficult personality. But I learned a ton from him, and we were good friends for a long time, and unfortunately passed, last year. But Charles gave me a quote from my book. We were talking one time, and what I thought was interesting was, Charles traveled. He's like me. He traveled all around for seminars, when we used to be able to do that. And he would go to a new city. He'd usually talk to some of his cop, seminar attendees, and he'd say, "Hey, what gym in town? Where all the criminals work out?" And he constantly did this in every city. And the reason he did it, and it made so much sense because it's the type of places I like to work out. If you go to a place where there's former criminals that are working out there for the most part, there's a level of respect within the gym that is almost non-existent in these really nice high-end gyms where everybody's really rude and they'll just grab weights in front of you. They'll move in front of you. They'll be rude. You don't do that in a gym where there's former inmates and prisoners and stuff, because there's a code there and they know it'll be backed up by violence. And so what is the default? People are a hell of a lot more, just cordial with each other, and you get great workouts.
It governs behavior.
Yeah. It's really interesting. It's one of those things where people, there's this idea that somehow studying violence and knowing how to use the tool makes you violent. And really, and I'm sure you feel the same way, the most highly competent people I know at using the tool of violence tend to be, for the most part, and there are a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, the most peaceful, mellow, cool people. They don't lose their head on anything. They certainly don't overreact in any situation. They understand when the tool would ever be applicable and useful, and they are not going to go anywhere near it until they absolutely are devoid of choice and they have to use it. It's really interesting. I think we would actually, if people had a better understanding of violence, I think discourse would be much more civil, and I think our ability to interact with each other would be a lot more civil. I think it's this illusion when we think violence won't be used, and we can be really as verbally abusive as we want and just be really horrible to each other with no consequence, no physical consequence. That's why people get so shocked when finally something happens and somebody just responds with violence, and they can't understand it, because they didn't understand what they were doing.
Yeah, I think there's a certain piece of, there's a humility that when you learn what you can do to another human body, you also understand what can be done to you. And I think you start to appreciate the consequences of cutting someone off or being rude or being because you don't know who you're dealing with. Like you don't know exactly what could happen to you. And certainly when you're involved in that high-end criminal world, it doesn't have to be, well, can the guy in front of me take me one-on-one? It's, could that guy in front of me have friends that are going to get to my wife and kids outside because he feels like his honor was challenged? When you start getting into that world, it's you really watch yourself. You watch how you conduct yourself.
You just hit on something that is worth bringing up. The other danger of training solely in combat sports and competition martial arts is that idea of the duel. The one-on-one. We tend to think violence is one-on-one. We tend to think it's going to be one and everybody's going to know what's up. What you just brought up is it's all the outliers. It's like, now I'm out in the street, not only am I dealing with whatever this is in front of me, but whatever this is in front of me might just be a diversion. The real threat might be back here with this little buddy that's sliding the knife out that I don't see because he's keeping me busy and stuff. So it's a whole other dichotomy that you have to be aware of. You have to understand, not just that, people love to just talk about situational awareness and all this. Yeah. It's more just understanding that combat sports gives us an artificial environment to gamify violence in. And as long as we recognize that those parameters do not exist in the street. And I know that seems highly logical, but look how people actually respond on the street. They respond like they're in the ring with a ref. And that's what gets a lot of them in trouble, because they never look behind them. They're never around. They don't understand that, there's probably multiple adversaries they're going to have to deal with, and that to me is the far more challenging problem. And to me, it's fascinating to deal with all the outliers, and to put no restraints on anything and just realize, hey, there are sometimes you're absolutely screwed, that, but it's good to know that. I've had clients that, I told the story the other day it's worth telling. I had a guy years ago who's now an instructor, but when he was coming up the ranks, He was going to get his graduate degree in San Diego, California. He worked at a really nice restaurant in a place called La Jolla, which is a nice part of San Diego. And he was coming back. He'd gone out with the busboy to dump some trash. And he was coming back in, and he was greeted at the back door with a guy that had a shotgun and a ski mask on. He immediately looked at the situation. He saw the angle that he was approaching this guy, the angle this guy had the shotgun and everything. He could safely take this guy out. He knew exactly what he would do. He just had the angle. But in the back of his mind, he's like, you know what? My whole staff's in there. I got to see what's going on. I don't know that this is the only guy. Sure enough, he goes in, 4 other guys with shotguns, holding everybody down. Everybody's prone on the ground. He makes the call right then and there. He goes, sure, I could have got out of here and left everybody. He goes, but no, there's no safe way for me to take action here.
Yeah.
So anyways, it turned out to just be a robbery. They're all prone on the ground. This guy, even though he knows he can't do anything, he's paying attention the whole time. He's looking around. Boom. Interesting thing was, after the event, luckily it was just a robbery, but he was the only employee that didn't need counseling after. A lot of them really were traumatized and counseled by that. He didn't need that. And he's a civilian. He wasn't some hardcore military guy. He was just a civilian. And he was the only one that was able to identify down to distinguishing tattoos on, in court of the guys that actually did it. And he was able to put them away. It was interesting. It's because he had done the work ahead of time. And he was absolutely okay. He wasn't beating himself up because he couldn't physically do anything. He realized, hey, the risk reward, it just isn't there for this. And that's what it gives you. Like, I learned a long time ago, I'm really good at what I do. And I truly am. I'm a master close combat instructor. I've instructed just about everybody you can think of. That would be, what impressive or anything. But the reality is this, I walk out my door and somebody catches me in the back of the head with a pipe. I go down just like everybody else. There's no, I have no immunity to violence. Violence is only good if I'm the one using it. But it works just as good on me. And it keeps you extremely humble. I'm never impressed. When people talk about stuff all the time, and what do you think about this guy? What do you think about that guy? It's usually somebody that's in the public that they're pointing out. And, I tell people kind of the same thing. I go, the most dangerous people I know, you wouldn't recognize the names and you wouldn't know who they are. I said, but they're like hitters for the Mexican mafia, just absolutely brutal individuals. I mean, no hesitation, extremely good at what they do and extremely devious in how they do it. I mean, just pure, like, I'll put the best quote unquote knife fighter in the world, knife instructor in the world up against one of these guys. And I know somebody knows how to kill, and I know who I'm going to bet on. Because it's very straightforward, and it's not, there's nothing. Violence is interesting. There's no reward. There's no payoff other than survival. That's the other thing that's hard. I think that's why a lot of people like to default to competition or combat sport, because why? There's a payoff. And I mean that in a very positive way. Meaning we put time into something and you get it. Can you become an instructor in my thing? Yeah, you can, but we don't really compete. It's just pure violence. And obviously it can get to people after all. I know people that have stopped training just because it starts to kind of wear on them. They don't like tearing apart the human body all the time. It gets to them mentally for some reason at that point, which I understand. But whereas if they were doing a traditional combat sport or martial art, they still probably enjoy the art. They'd probably still do it because we directly remind people what the result is of your work. And this is why we're doing it to get a specific, result. I want to take away the other guy's ability to think and move. I need control of his brain, because until I have control of his brain through injury, he can think and move, and he's dangerous. I mean, I could grab a tool that he has. Maybe I'm grabbing a knife, that he has. It doesn't, all I've done is I've controlled one option that he has when he has the rest of his body available to him and he knows how to use it. And there are plenty of instances, where we have people who literally will give up a limb to get what they want. I mean, one of the big stories that I like is my avatar. At the end of every seminar, I tell people who my training avatar is. And it's this little guy. Like, I don't think he's 5'5". But he's bald. He's got two little horns tattooed here, and he is somebody who in Ukiah, California, in the early '90s, he was at a Walmart. His girlfriend, he sent his girlfriend into to steal some stuff. Walmart security got her. They called the cops. The cop that showed up is a guy named Marcus Young. He was a sergeant, really well trained, former 82nd Airborne guy, military, defensive tactics expert, martial artist, world-class martial artist, and trained for a long time. He, out of the corner of his eyes, he's putting the girl in, he's taking her from Walmart security, put her in the back of his police car. He looks over and he sees this guy that I just described in a hoodie, with his hoodie up, both hands in his pocket, deliberately walking towards the police car. Marcus Young sees him, points at him, gives him a verbal, goes, show me your hands. This guy continues walking towards him. Marcus realizes, oh, this guy's closing in now. Says it one more time, show me your hands. And out of one of the pockets comes a knife. The guy goes, have a knife. Marcus, being the trained person, he understands, I don't have time to deploy my weapon. I'm going after this guy. Sure enough, he goes in and he effects a double wrist crank, which absolutely snaps and tears the connective tissue of the wrist. He can feel that happening as he's slamming him, and he's also turning 270 to slam him on top of the back of the car. As he's doing that, out of the other pocket comes the 5-round revolver that he empties into Marcus, hitting him 4 times. Okay, he gave his limb up, knowing full well Marcus was going to go after it because that's what he wanted. That's how committed he was to it. So then Walmart security, to their credit, they come in, attack the guy. They grab the revolver. He lets go of the now empty revolver. In his maimed hand, he's still holding his knife. He takes it in his good hand and he stabs Walmart security twice. Wow. Drops him. Now, the good part about the story is there's an Explorer scout there. He helps Marcus, the officer, actually on his side, offhand, hold the weapon up, shoot this guy twice as he's trying to pull the rifle out of the police car that they had, the AR rifle in there. So it ends that way. But what I try to tell people is it was written up in a very famous magazine here. It's studied all the time, but nobody ever points out the one thing. Now listen, both the Walmart security guy and Marcus were absolutely heroic in what they did. Absolutely. But nobody pointed out the fact that both of these guys were trained to think the tool was the problem, and they kept the weapon active. Nobody thought about shutting down the brain, because if you shut down the brain, all of that goes away. And nobody did that. They tried to grab and control tools and leaving this active. And so that's kind of my avatar for everything. It's the human brain that we have to shut down. We have to learn how to do that. And that's why it's worth learning anatomy. That's why it's worth learning trauma of the human body. And what is a big enough stimulus to take the brain out of the equation. To me, it's fascinating. And what's great about that is it bypasses bigger, faster, stronger. Yeah. And so it's available to all of us, Now, that does not mean that you're trained like this and I can throw you in a ring, with whoever the predator is. What I train people to do is the predator gives them an opportunity, pulls them in close enough to a vulnerable part of anatomy that they now know what to do with. And if they take advantage of it, they absolutely can start taking down a bigger, faster, stronger person. But they have to understand injury, and they have to understand how to put systemic injury on somebody. But I will tell you, some of the most unlikely people in the world that I've trained have been able to protect themselves against bigger, faster, stronger threats because they understood injury to the human body. It's just one of those things that can absolutely save lives, but it has no place in competition, and it would not. It's not something that we train people to actively go out and try to compete with somebody on this. It's really something that you hold. It's your nuclear weapon, basically. It's your personal nuclear weapon that you'd only use in extreme circumstances and when you're absolutely devoid of choice. And people often ask me, they go, well, when would I ever use, your training, what you train in target focused training? And I said, you would use it against a threat that if you had access to a firearm, you would feel justified using that firearm and emptying it into the threat. That is the threshold for anything that we're showing you right now. And when you put it in that threshold, it's really easy for people, you're going to stay out of trouble, because basically if there's ever a choice the choice is always to leave. The choice is always to get out of there. It's when you're devoid of choice. It's when you have no choice and you're facing imminent grievous bodily harm. And, the only thing, unfortunately, at that point that's going to work for you is using the tool of violence.
When violence is the answer. It's a nice way to wrap up the bulk of the interview, Tim. For those of you that are not joining us for the bonus round, I just want to thank Tim. Tim, if people want to learn more about you, where can I send them?
I'm on all I'm on Instagram is Tim Larkin at TFT. That's a good place to go. Obviously surviveviolence.com, and they can get, if you like what we were talking about, I send out newsletters that come out there. There's no, we don't spam you guys or anything, but you can get a lot of great information for free. Cause I really want people to understand the approach. I don't know if I can help them or not, and that's why I try to put out enough information so people can check out our approach. And if it's for you, I'd love to have you as a client, buy a book or check us out. That would be great. But first off, I want to give you some good information.
That's awesome. Thank you very much for your time, mate. You've been very generous and you've been a fantastic guest. So I thank you for that. You're going to stick around and do the bonus round questions. But for those that are leaving us here, thank you again, Tim Larkin.
Thanks, guys.
How awesome was that? Tim Larkin dropping bombs of knowledge left, right, and center. That was a great conversation. Tim was very generous with his time, and he was even more generous in the bonus round. So if you head over to patreon.com/managing violence and subscribe over there, you will hear nearly half an hour, I think maybe a little touch over half an hour maybe, of bonus content from Tim Larkin as he answers the Magnificent 7 bonus questions. For everyone else, if you'll leave us here, we'll see you again next week. Talk to you soon.